Hi, this is Joyful Spirit, bringing you Diablo 3 Item Guide. How to set up your items for Act 1, 2 and 3 Inferno. In the first segment of this guide, I will talk about the general ideas of itemization that applies to every class, and then I'm gonna talk about your class in specific. And I'll spare you some stupid details like, what is a set item? Well, a set item is an item that gives a set bonus if you have 2 of them equipped. Screw that. You're gonna learn some good stuff. You're actually gonna learn stuff that you didn't know before. I'm gonna solve a common problem in Diablo 3 community. People get into Inferno and there are so many stats in these items, so many things to look at. There's the crit chance, there's the attack speed, there's damage against elites, there's melee, there's protection from melee damage, from range damage, from elite damage. What to focus on, what to ignore. How to spend your hard-earned money without wasting it or something that sucks. And this is all for level 60 only. If you're below level 60, then seriously, what are you doing in this guide? Just go play the game. How are you not level 60 anyway? My grandma could do it by now. Just go play. And if you are level 60, then keep watching because this is some good stuff. First of all, let's talk about the item types. And I don't mean the blue, the green, you can see the colors. Screw that. Let's take all these 13 items and divide them into 3 groups. Let's simplify things so that you can think about itemization in simple ways. First group is your weapon and your offhand. This is where your DPS directly comes from. This is where you focus directly on your DPS. If you get some stats on your weapon and offhand, that's fine, but first of all, focus on the damage. If it's an offensive offhand, focus on the damage. If it's a weapon, focus on your damage. Also on your weapon, focus on critical damage. It's the most important stat on your weapon. You're gonna have just some stats on your weapon, you can have some lifesteal, that's cool. But first of all, have critical damage there. You can have it in form of critical damage on or in form of a socket in which you just put an emerald and you have critical hit damage. If you have an offensive offhand, always look for your damage values and for critical hit chance. It's your main source of critical hit chance. I believe it goes up to 10%. Also have your core stat on your offhand, of course. Let's not get into too much detail on shields. It's class specific, but generally don't watch for block percentage and values. Watch for armor, crit chance and stats on your shield. The block percentage will just be there if you buy a good shield. The second group of items is your ring, your amulet, your helmet, your gloves, your bracers. The stuff in which you can buy critical hit chance and damage. That's the part of your armor that is mostly responsible for your damage output. If you're buying these, then of course get your core stat there, of course get some all resistance, but focus on having critical hit chance and damage there if possible. Every piece in that group can have chance, and only gloves, rings, and amulet can have critical hit damage. So make sure you have that on these items. Because in your third group, you can't get the critical hit related stuff. And your third group is your boots, your legs, your belt, your chest armor, and your shoulders. That's where you focus mostly on your defense. Of course, the second group will have some defense too, but the general idea is to focus on the offensive where you can, even at a small cost of your defense, and then make up for it by focusing on the defense on your third group items where you can't get any critical hit chance related stuff. This is the general rule of itemization. There's a group of items that you can get critical hit chance on and you get it there, and a group of armor where you can't get it, so you focus mainly on defense there. You focus on armor there, or on all resistance, on vitality, and on your core stat items. So those are the 3 groups of items. This is the way to think about itemization. I hope it makes things easier and simpler for you. Instead of buying 13 different items, you just buy 3 different groups of items. And another rule is to spend a little bit more money on some items and a little bit less on other items. There are items who just make bigger difference. And that's your weapon, that's your offhand, that's your gloves, that's your amulet. Invest more into these. And invest a little bit less into the rest. Now, what kind of numbers to go for if you want to farm Act 1, Act 2, Act 3? I'm gonna give you the required amount of all resistance, of DPS, of life for these acts, but keep in mind, this is just my opinion based on my tests and my experience. If you disagree with it, then your opinion is probably as valuable as mine. So these are just rough estimates for 1.0.4 patch. If there's a later patch where Blizzard nerfs all the monsters to hell and you one-shot everything in Act 3 without buying anything at all, then of course these numbers don't apply anymore, but as of 1.0.4, these are pretty accurate, I would say, based on my tests for 3 different classes. So for Act 1, you want your all resistance to be at around 400. That means almost every piece of your equipment will consist some all resistance, but it's not that hard to get, really. You don't really need to pay attention to armor yet, just get what you get. Your unbuffed DPS should be at around 10 to 15k. Don't worry about crit chance and crit damage too much. For Act 1, just get a decent armor and a decent amount of your core stat. And by unbuffed DPS, I mean without Sharpshooter on your Demon Hunter, without Glass Cannon on your Sorcerer, without abilities that influence the DPS. I mean just the DPS that comes from items. And then have your life at around 20 or 25k and you'll be fine. So basically, each item you buy will be worth around 20 to 40k. That's really cheap. That's like 400k gold for all of your equipment. And you can get that much money if you just win hell and go straight to Inferno. You will have that kind of money. So just get your equipment and you'll be fine in Act 1. Needless to say. And then for Act 2, have all of your resistances at around 550. That's around 65% damage reduction, something like that. And then your armor, you need to start to pay attention to it. For ranged classes, 3000 will be enough. For melee classes, 4000 will be enough. Some people ignore armor in Act 2, and I believe that to be a mistake. I believe that investing in armor at certain points starts to become more cost-effective than investing in all resistance. Your unbuffed DPS should be at around 25,000, which means you should start investing in crit chance and crit damage items. You don't need both crit chance and damage on every ring and amulet, but have at least one crit chance or crit damage on every item from the second group of armor. That way you will get enough DPS to handle Act 2 easily. So basically every item you buy for Act 2 will cost between 100 and 500,000 gold. That would mean around 5 million for all of your equipment. This will make you fine in Act 2. The numbers will be a little bit different for every class, but you get the general idea. You know what to expect. For Act 3, you want all of your resistances to be at around 700. A little bit more if you're melee, maybe a little bit less if you're ranged. Your armor, about 5k for ranged, 5000 for ranged, and about 7000 for melee. If you have a tendency of neglecting armor, let this be an eye-opener for you. You really need your armor in Act 3, not just resistances, but 5000 armor for ranged and 7000 for melee. Melee classes have the advantage of skills that influence your armor, like Seize the Initiative for the Monk. So as long as your armor pieces without crit chance have armor bonuses in them, you should be fine. Just make sure every piece of armor from the third group has some armor bonus in it. So your unbuffed DPS should be around 40k, which should be a natural thing. If you have a good weapon with a lot of critical damage, a good offhand with a lot of critical hit chance, and armor pieces with crit chance and crit damage where possible, you should be at around 40k unbuffed DPS. It should be fine. And as far as your life, get around 30-35k. You don't need 50,000 health, you just don't. Focus on your resistances, focus on your armor instead. It's gonna be better off for you. So each item for Act 3 farming should be worth between 1 million and 5 million each. That's gonna probably be 1 million for bracers, for belt, for pants, but then 5 million for your amulet, for your gloves, maybe for your weapon. Overall, your equipment will cost about 40 million. If you have around 40 million gold, you can buy yourself equipment for Act 3 and be completely fine and comfortable there. If you have 20 or 30 million, you can still find a way. 40 million is just a general number. So now that you know how much you need to spend for each act, what are some buying rules that will make buying easier for you? First of all, you probably already know this, but let's just say it like it is. Bidding is cheaper than buyout. If you have time, just bid. There was a time when I was a poor demon hunter from a small fishing village without too much gold, just farming Act 2 like a poor demon hunter that I was, until something dropped a freaking 30 million gold ring. I had no money, and then I had a shit ton of money. I had 30 million gold out of nowhere, and I went nuts. I had an impulse to just find a 30 million gold weapon and buy it. Go buy the weapon. I'll be a badass. Fortunately, I held my horses and I thought about it for a second, and this one item actually bought me all that Act 3 equipment I needed. And that's because I wasn't looking for buyouts, but I was looking for bids. I spent 3 days tracking the auction house, tracking the bids, and bidding on items without buying out anything. Bidding is like saving money without having to do anything. You just wait and you save 50% from each of your purchase. Just bid every time you're not in a total hurry. Also, distribute your money evenly across all of your gear. Don't buy a 10 million weapon and then 1 million offhand. Get a 3 million weapon and a 3 million offhand. That's gonna be much bigger return on investment for you. That's gonna do much better for you. Also keep in mind the stepping stones. 20 to 40k for Act 1, 100 to 500k for Act 2, 1 to 5 million for Act 3. So for example, if you have an armor piece that is worth 100,000 gold, and you can have an opportunity to buy an armor piece that's worth 500,000 gold, then of course it's better. It's 5 times worth more, so it's better. But is it worth to buy it? No! Because you're doing fine in Act 2 with your 100,000 gold armor, and 500,000 gold armor is probably not enough for Act 3. So you'll have this armor in between acts that doesn't really get you to the higher act. So it's better to just save your money and buy even better armor later on. Remember the stepping stones and do a full jump with your items from Act 2 to Act 3. It's much more efficient than buying stuff in between acts that you will have to sell later on for cheaper than you bought it. Now, when buying equipment, you always need to keep in mind the diminishing returns. What does it mean, diminishing return? It means if you want to buy a chest armor with 100 dexterity, you can do that for 1,000 gold. If you want to buy a chest armor with 150 dexterity, you can buy it for 10,000 gold. If you want to buy a chest armor with 200 dexterity, you gotta pay a couple of million. The more you stack up a single stat, the higher the prices go, exponentially. Therefore, it's bad to, for example, ignore armor completely and stack up a lot of all resistance. Go max out on all resistance while ignoring your armor. That's bad. That's gonna cost you way more than receiving the same kind of resistance from mix of armor and all resistances. You need to balance your armor and all resistance. You need to balance your critical damage and critical chance. You need to balance your health and your sustainability. And I'm gonna tell you how. How to balance your armor and your resistances. As I already told you, in Act 1 ignore your armor. In Act 2 aim for a little bit higher percentage of damage reduction from resistances than armor. You can check your damage reduction percentage by just putting your mouse over your armor or your resistance. And you want to have a couple percent more damage resistance from your resistances than armor. That's kind of the proper balance. As for crit damage and crit chance, you basically want 1% of crit chance for every 10% crit damage. So if you have a weapon with 80% critical damage, you want to balance it out with, let's say, 8% offhand critical chance. If you have gloves with 50% critical damage, then you want an amulet with 5% critical chance. This is the optimal ratio. I've seen some people do math on that. I didn't do it myself, but I read a couple of people calculate that stuff, and it did make sense to just go for 1% of critical chance for every 10% of critical damage. So balance yourself that way. And now health and sustainability. What is sustainability? Well, sustainability is your ability to sustain yourself, obviously enough. So if you're playing a monk, your sustainability comes from the breath of heaven, your healing skill, your healing mantra, and other stuff that heals you, like the rune for serenity that heals you. That's your sustainability. You can also increase your sustainability by buying life on hit weapons and lifesteal weapons. It's a really good idea on Monk, incidentally. Generally, you don't want too much HP, because if you stack up your health to 50,000, then that's what you're gonna have during the fight, and if you lose that health, it's gonna be really hard to replace it, because your healing skills, your sustainability does not generally scale up with your HP pool. So the more life you have, the harder it will be to actually sustain yourself and heal yourself. I would say almost every time it's much better to invest in damage mitigation, like all resistance and armor, than it is to invest in vitality and life. You do want to have about 35,000 life in Act 3 Inferno, but don't go too far outside of that, because it's gonna be hard to sustain yourself. Even though you don't get one-shotted by anything, it's gonna be really hard to replace your HP once you lose it. Just go for sustainability. If you wanna have more HP, it's a good idea to get a life on hit weapon, a lifesteal weapon, because then you will get back the HP as you are fighting. You don't need a huge HP pool, just make sure you don't get one-shotted. So this wraps up the general item guide, and now let's take a look at some monk specific stuff. I'm gonna tell you 2 general rules of itemization on the monk, then I'm gonna talk about the weapon choice, what to choose, 2 weapons, 2-handed or a weapon and a shield, and then I'm gonna talk about sets, and we're gonna wrap things up. So, first of all, as a monk, you don't want a lot of health. That's right, you don't want a lot of health, you want a lot of sustainability. Monk is a class that is specifically focused on healing himself. You have a lot of heals, you have Breath of Heaven, you have the Rune for Serenity, you have the Mantra of Healing, and you have really quick attack speed, which complements very well with life on hit weapons. That means you want to sustain yourself, not just have a lot of health. Make sure you have enough health to not die, and then go for sustainability. Go for weapons with life on hit, go for weapons with lifesteal. That's definitely my favorite way of playing the monk. Even if you can't afford the weapons, just focus on your healing ability, not on your huge health pool. What does it mean exactly? Well, it means that I suggest you play Act 1 with 20,000 health, Act 2 with 25,000 health, and Act 3 with 30,000 health. With enough sustainability, this should do it. If you're dying too much, just grab a weapon with lifesteal. So that's rule number 1, sustainability, not health. Rule number 2, 1 with everything. You obviously know what it is. It's the passive that makes your highest resistance the all resistance. So if you have 500 cold resistance, with this passive you have 500 all resistance. And of course, use it all the time. What's more, don't make a stupid mistake of picking physical resistance or fire resistance as your main resistance. You want to pick poison, arcane or cold. Why? Because fire and physical are the only resistances that are actually useful to other classes. Fire resistance is really useful to every class because Mortar hits with fire and it is a very annoying ability. Barbarians like fire resistance because molten enemies are really annoying. Now physical resistance is just good because most things hit physically. So these 2 resistances, maybe you've noticed it, are gonna be a little bit more expensive on the auction house. Fire and physical are gonna be more expensive than poison, arcane or cold. So I strongly recommend you pick poison, arcane or cold as your secondary resistance that will count with the 1 with everything buff. I use cold, I believe cold is the least useful resistance, so it should be the cheapest one. Fire and physical might be targeted by other classes just because they're good by themselves, so I do not recommend you pick them as your secondary resistance. Pick poison, arcane or cold. Now, weapon choice. What weapons to choose? I'm gonna get it out of the way. 2-handed weapons, even though they received a buff in 1.0.4, they're still kinda weak. They do not justify for not having 2 weapons or a shield. 2 weapons give you insane attack speed, which can be used for life on hit, which can be used for spirit generation, which is really good. 2-handed weapons, they're slow, they don't generate as much spirit, which means you don't get to use as many abilities. They don't really pay off for it. If you really intend on using a 2-handed weapon, make sure it has a 300 dexterity or something, because it can. And it should. But generally, I do not recommend 2-handed weapons. I recommend 2 weapons if you wanna focus your character a little bit more offensively, a little bit more around life on hit, lifesteal. And make sure both of your weapons actually get a critical hit damage and life on hit. Because these are the reasons why two weapons are such a good choice. Every weapon can get an insane critical damage buff, even up to 200, I believe, if you put the highest tier green gem into socket and then get a really good percentage buff outside of the socket. You can have an insane critical damage from your weapons. So that's the main reason to use two weapons, to get an insane amount of critical damage and life on hit and lifesteal. If you don't want to go there, go with weapon and shield. That's the most popular choice, and that's the choice I am going for. Shield gives you a lot of armor. That's the main reason for doing shield. It gives you a shit ton of armor, and if you're going for two weapons, you'd better have a lot of armor on your armor, because you're not gonna have this 1000-1500 buff from the shield. So if you have shield, watch primarily for the armor value and get the crit chance if possible. If you want to have a good shield for Act 2, Act 3, get a critical chance on your shield. You can have a critical chance on your shield, and you should have a lot of critical hit chance on your shield. It goes up to 10%, I believe. And then of course the primary stat and the vitality is also a good addition, but mainly your shield is about armor and critical chance. And then in terms of item sets, Monk is not really a good class for item sets. There is no real set that you could point to and would say, this is the Monk set, it's really good. There is Inna's set. It's primarily targeted for monks because it gives spirit regeneration, it gives life for spirit spent, which is by the way a really bad stat that I don't recommend you to use. It doesn't scale into Inferno. And Inna's set is based mostly on convenience. It gives you run speed. Seriously, running speed, that's just totally convenience. I guess the only thing worse than run speed would be the range of gold pickup on your set. Thank God the Inna set doesn't have that one. But yeah, this set doesn't have resistance in it, and you actually kinda need resistance if you wanna play the monk. So if you're using Inna set, you really don't have any resistance on you almost whatsoever. So if you end up using the Inna set, you're gonna pay a lot of money and you're not gonna have almost any resistance on your monk, which is really bad, so I don't recommend you use Inna set. What you can do is you can grab two pieces from the Demon Hunter set. You can get Natalia's Bloody Footprints, which is the boots from the set. It gives you reduced damage from melee attacks by 5-6%. It sounds like a good idea since Monk is fighting in melee range. It also gives movement speed and all resistance, which the Inna set does not have. And then you can use Natalia's Reflection, which is the ring from Natalia's set. It's pretty damn expensive, but for Act 3 it's totally worth it. It gives you attack speed, which sounds like a good idea for a monk. It gives you a lot of resistance, it gives you dexterity, all the good stuff. And if you have those two items from Natalia's set on you, you get the critical hit chance increased by 7%. Sounds good to me. If you wanna be a total badass in Act 3 and 4 Inferno, grab those two pieces from Natalia's set. That's a good idea. That essentially wraps up the item guild for a monk. If you enjoyed this guide, check out Joyful Gaming channel, you're gonna find more good stuff in there. I'll see you there.